earlier this month, I made the best video of 2024, which is great because it really takes the pressure off for the next 11. In that video, I mentioned at the end a little bit about how our legal system appears to discriminate against critical thinkers, quoting a professor of criminal justice named Jim Fisher. In the 1930s, August Vollmer, John Wigmore, and others worked hard to get the expert into court. 70 years later, judges should be throwing half of them out. In the field of scientific document examination, the graphologists are no longer at the gate, they're in the courthouse. In America, everyone has a right to express their opinion, but not in court. If everyone is an expert, no one is. Albert S. Osborne said it first: judges have to find a way to identify the phonies. But because these charlatans have become such clever impersonators, it's not easy. They've created bogus diplomas, phony journals, fraudulent professional organizations, and counterfeit resumes. They're dug in, and it's going to take extreme measures to blast them out. If judges don't take responsibility for this task, little will change. Jurors are no longer capable of spotting the frauds. In fact, one way to avoid jury duty is to exhibit a rational mind and knowledge of science. I followed that up with my own personal experience, saying, that jibes with my recent experience being excused from a jury. And in the comments, a lot of you were curious to know more about this, about my experience in particular, and also the data on this as a potential systemic issue in our criminal justice system. So, I sat down that day to record a telling of my own experience for my alternative channel. But as I started to record, it occurred to me that I was no longer quite sure that that is what happened to me, nor was I sure that this is as common a problem as Osborne seemed to think. After all, if lawyers actively avoided putting critical thinkers on juries, wouldn't that result in an unfair system by definition? And while I do think our justice system is incredibly flawed in many ways and deeply unfair, I'm not confident that juries are necessarily one of the worst problems. So instead of an off-the-cuff video on the alternative channel, I decided to do some research, challenge my own views, and share what I found with you here on Maine. But since I'm on the topic, if you do want to see more casual day-to-day videos and, of course, more videos of my dog, Indy, you might want to head over to Rebeccawatson and subscribe. I have long heard grumblings from scientists, critical thinkers, and people who are really attached to their score on IQ tests that they never get to serve on juries because they're just too smart. Obviously, when I put it that way, you already know that I initially viewed these claims with skepticism. It came across to me as humble bragging. Like, I'm far too clever to be fooled by the rhetorical tricks of the average lawyer. So the second they even see me with my giant head full of brains, they send me straight home. Like, okay, honey, sure. Back then, I was fairly nomadic, so I had actually avoided jury selection for quite a while. But about 8 years ago, I settled down here in the Bay Area, and since then, I've had several more experiences with jury duty, and I started to change my mind a bit. So let's start with my anecdotal experience. First of all, a correction, it was not, as I said in that last video, recent. In researching this video, I went back through my journals and my social media to figure out when I was called for jury duty last. And it was August 2022, more than a year ago. I was sure it was like August of 2023. What is time? I don't know. Anyway, back in 2022, I received a notice that I was officially on the hook for jury duty. The way it worked was that the night before I was to go in, I was supposed to go online and see if they needed me. A few times in the past, I've gotten off the hook at that point because they call more people than they need, and often they let whole groups go before they even need to show up at the courthouse. In this case, I did have to report. So I went to the courthouse and sat in a room with dozens and dozens of other people. We watched a little video about how important juries are, and then we filled out a multi-page questionnaire. I've done this a few times now, and every time the questionnaire has been ridiculously stupid. It's a lot of standard information that makes sense, like, hey, do you know anyone from this list of important people involved in this case? Or what's your job? What's your education level? Stuff like that. But then there are gems, like my favorite question this round. It was, have you, your immediate family or close friends, ever had a good or bad interaction with a police officer? And then please describe each encounter. Like, yeah, I live in the United States. Literally everyone I know has had an experience with a police officer, most of them bad. How much time do you have? Are there extra pages I can attach to this? Because I've got a novel to write. After filling out the questionnaire, I handed it in and went home, but then I had to come back for a process that's known as voir dire. It's where the attorneys and the judge basically question the potential jury members to figure out who ultimately will be on the jury. So they called us all into a courtroom. The judge kicked things off by going through everyone who had submitted a request to be excused from jury duty for a number of reasons. It was a fascinating mix of people with genuinely acceptable reasons, like, you know, they would lose too much income. They are the sole caretaker of a baby or an elderly person. Maybe their English isn't good enough to follow along with a court case, things like that. And then there were the people who just desperately did not want to be there, like a guy who argued that he was way too racist against white people to be impartial. Like, he was very open about this. And the judge spent like 15 minutes arguing with him. Like, sure, we all hate white people a little bit, but can you put that aside for this case? No, Your Honor, I absolutely cannot. White people set up this entire system to oppress my people, which, you know, fair enough. I was actually more annoyed with the judge for wasting everyone's time going back and forth with this guy. But I guess the point was to just let everyone else know that if you want to get out of jury duty, you're going to have to really work for it. The judge also went through and called out anyone who hadn't answered questions fully on that initial survey, or if they wrote something that was unclear. For instance, one question asked whether we were prepared to convict regardless of sentencing, and I had written no. So the judge asked me to elaborate. I said that I would never vote to convict someone if the sentence was death. He said, well, this isn't a death penalty case, which I knew because California has a moratorium on the death penalty right now, but I mean, I'm honest to a fault. So anyway, the judge determined that I could stay. He also asked me to expand upon my job because that was confusing. So I explained, you know, I make videos on YouTube about science and critical thinking. The attorneys also got to ask us some questions, I think to still root out anyone who could be dismissed with cause. For instance, the defense counsel asked if we all agreed that a person was innocent until proven guilty. And a few people said no, and they were genuinely shocked to learn that this is a foundational tenet of our justice system. One woman insisted for at least 10 minutes that the person on trial must be guilty because why would they even be here if they weren't? Great question, lady. Great question. The prosecutor then asked if we would agree to vote guilty even if we didn't feel that the law in question was fair or legitimate. If the evidence points to guilt, if this person you feel is guilty of this law, will you vote guilty regardless of how you feel about the law? And this time everyone nodded their head yes, except for me. And now it was my turn to be shocked. First, to realize I was the only one saying no. And second, that I had apparently gotten this question wrong. According to the prosecutor. He singled me out and patiently explained to me that it's the jury's job only to find the facts and determine whether or not a person is guilty or not guilty of a certain crime, not to determine whether or not the crime should be a crime. And then he asked me again, would I convict someone of a crime I didn't believe was a crime? And they handed me a microphone. And I said, no. I said I might be wrong. Please correct me if so, but it is my understanding that it is my right as a member of a jury to return whatever vote I feel is fair, regardless of what the evidence shows. For instance, if I lived in a state where abortion was illegal and I was on a jury for a case against a doctor who had definitely performed an abortion, I personally would be morally obligated to vote not guilty, and I believe that that would be my right. I think that's pretty much word for word what I said, which I only remember because at the time I was just frantically trying to avoid saying the phrase jury nullification. That's the term that describes what I was saying. In the United States, juries have the right to vote not guilty, even if they think guilt has been proven beyond reasonable doubt, because they feel the law is unfair or is being unfairly applied in that particular case. I am not a lawyer, but I do think I understand this concept correctly. And I think all jurors should know that they have this right. But I've also heard that you can get in trouble for saying the words jury nullification in a courtroom or for trying to educate your fellow jurors about it. It seems super dystopian, but I've heard of judges finding people in contempt of court for doing things like that. So I was really walking on eggshells. My problem was that this prosecutor, much like the judge with the anti-white guy, would just not give up. He asked me the question again, but with slightly different vocabulary, and we stared at each other. I desperately did not want to be held in contempt of court, so I spoke very carefully, saying something along the lines of, I've described a case that I think would be a clear example, and I've said that I believe that's my right, but I'm not the expert here. If that isn't my right, please tell me and I will change my mind. But you have not yet told me that I'm wrong. And at that point, he just looked really annoyed and everybody was silent and it was awkward. So I added, I understand this is a murder case. I don't have any moral objections to laws against murder. So that ended the questioning. I was allowed to stay. In retrospect, I think he was asking because the accused murderers, there were two, were planning a self-defense argument. So I guess maybe that could come up. Somebody could say, well, they're guilty, but are they really guilty? You know, all of that took an entire day to figure out which jurors could be excused for cause. There's a set number of reasons why you can excuse a juror in that case. But the next day we came back in and the attorneys were now allowed to question each of us and then dismiss for basically any reason they want, so long as it's not racial or sexist. So over the course of a few hours, we sat there while people were called upon to explain themselves and their viewpoints. It was usually things like, you wrote in your questionnaire that you gave money to the police union last year. Would that bias you in favor of the police? And then they would say no. And so the prosecutor would say, we have no objections to this juror. And then the defense would move to excuse them anyway. Because who gives money to the police union? It's not even a real union. Every time the rare juror was bland enough to make it through this questioning, they took a seat on the final jury. And then all of the people who were hoping to avoid jury duty would relax a little bit, because if 12 people get through before they're even called, they get to go home. There were maybe 3 or 4 jurors chosen by the time they called my name. I was sitting in the back of the courtroom with a book in my lap, and by the time I gathered up my things and stood up, the prosecutor announced that they would like to excuse me and thanks for my time. That was the first time all day that had happened. Like, they didn't even wait for me to get to the front of the courtroom and say hello and answer a question or two. I probably looked like a deer in the headlights. The other potential jurors laughed. So I said, thanks, have a great day, and I left. So yeah, part of me does walk away from that interaction thinking that I was excused for being too informed, too honest. Jury nullification is an important concept for Americans to understand because it does give the average person the power to disrupt unjust laws. Yes, you can be the person to let an abortion doctor in Texas go free. You can free the guy who murdered the priest who molested him 20 years ago. You can help that kid caught with a bag of cannabis avoid the school-to-prison pipeline. There are prison abolitionists and other activists who support jury nullification in all cases simply because the justice system is so screwed up and biased. And they suggest people hide their views and their knowledge specifically to get on juries and then nullify them. I am not one of those people. While I know the game is rigged, that our police are corrupt, that our district attorneys are flawed, and that our prisons generally fail to rehabilitate the people we put in them, and in fact often release those people in a worse situation than when they went in, I still think that there are times when a grievous crime has been committed and the correct person has been arrested, and that person deserves to be held accountable in some way. But from a prosecutor's standpoint, why bother with a woman who is overall statistically less likely to vote to convict when there are a few dozen people left who nodded their heads like sheep when he asked them a leading question, implying that the answer was yes. So, yeah, I'm not surprised he sent me home, and I do think it was maybe due to my open embrace of knowledge and critical thinking, which go hand in hand with my progressive ideology, which is also something a prosecutor doesn't necessarily want on a jury. All of that said, my experience is just one data point, and it's heavily biased. I'm not inside the prosecutor's head, and even if I was dismissed for that reason, it doesn't mean that that's happening every day in every courtroom across the country. So, I decided to check the literature. I have to say, it was extremely difficult to find studies on potential discrimination against rational people in jury selection for two reasons. The first reason is because most research on jury discrimination involves race and gender, because that is absolutely 100% without a doubt a real problem with our justice system in the past and even today. Even if there is discrimination found against rational, intelligent, educated people, the discrimination against people for their race and gender is way worse. Historically, white men have rigged the system to prioritize white men. Slaves were property and could not serve on juries. Freed black men were banned from juries in most states. And even after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1875, juries still magically came out looking extremely white and extremely male. Back then, serving on a jury was considered as important a right as voting, a constitutionally protected way for the average person to actively influence their society. So obviously, marginalized people were prevented from participating at all costs. Law after Supreme Court ruling would attempt to change this, but of course, the system would just adjust subtly to allow discrimination to continue because it was thought that women in general and Black people in general would be less likely to convict someone of a crime. Just last year, researchers created an algorithm to examine 26,000 questions lawyers and judges posed to jurors in 17 capital murder cases in South Carolina. And they found stark differences in the questions that prosecutors posed to white men and those they posed to women and Black people. As a press release for the study described, the analysis showed significant differences in the length, complexity, and sentiment of the questions prosecutors asked of Black potential jurors compared to white ones, indicating they were likely attempting to shape their responses. The questions asked by judges and the defense showed no such racial differences. The study also found evidence that prosecutors had attempted to disqualify Black individuals by using their views on the death penalty. Prosecutors asked Black potential jurors, especially those who were ultimately excused from serving, more explicit and graphic questions about execution methods compared to white potential jurors. In 6 of the 17 cases analyzed in the study, a judge had later ruled that the prosecutor illegally removed potential jurors on the basis of race. By looking at the combined NLP analyses for each case, the researchers could successfully distinguish between cases that violated Batson versus Kentucky and ones that hadn't. As always, links to everything I talk about are in the transcript, linked down below. It's on my Patreon. It's free for everyone to read and click if you would like to learn more. But once I got past the hundreds of studies documenting discrimination based on race and sex and how bad it is, I was still at a loss for how to even define critical thinking. In the end, I was forced to go with a slightly problematic stand-in: education. Obviously, there are grade school dropouts with sharper critical thinking skills than Harvard postgrads, but research does suggest that students' critical thinking skills improve throughout college, and also it's fair to assume that lawyers, particularly prosecutors, might associate education with rational thinking, and that they might be equally discriminatory to both education and demonstrated critical thinking skills. With that in mind, there was a study published in 2006 that sought to finally put to the test the conventional wisdom that said that juries end up composed of mostly people of lesser intelligence. The researchers examined trials in the state of Connecticut and looked at the education of jurors and potential jurors, finding that there was no evidence that more educated people were being excused at a higher rate. In fact, they found that overall, juries in Connecticut tended to be more educated than the average citizen. In 2017, another group of researchers combed through about 1,300 survey respondents in Texas to note differences between people who had and had not served on a jury. They found that those who believe in the importance of speaking English are less compassionate, support biblical literalism, and express more concern about the community effects of wrongdoing are more likely to have been former jurors than to not have served. Death penalty support is also modestly predictive of jury membership. Non-jurors rate their neighborhoods as cleaner than do former jurors. Results point to composition effects in the summoning process and to the possibility that some types of people exempt themselves from this civic obligation. So in Texas, at least, it seems that being a progressive critical thinker makes you less likely to serve on a jury. But of course, that doesn't tell us whether prosecutors are purposely weeding these people out or if these people are just more successful at weeding themselves out, getting themselves out of jury duty, considering it's a thing that most people seem to want to avoid. The research on this topic is overall pretty hard to come by and hardly comprehensive or conclusive. But after reading through all of this, I was starting to feel that any discrimination against educated or rational people in jury selection just isn't that big of a deal if it's a real thing at all. My experience, maybe it could be better explained by my gender or my suspected ideology rather than my knowledge or my critical thinking. That's kind of where I was left after reading these studies. After the studies, I started reading opinion pieces by legal experts, like this 2010 post from Allison K. Bennett, MS, titled, "Do We Need Einsteins in the Jury Box? The Role and Impact of Juror IQ." I found this while searching for problematic stand-ins for critical thinking, and boy, is it problematic. Bennett points out that low IQ jurors do likely benefit prosecutors because they're more likely to just believe whatever an authority figure tells them, and they're also more swayed by arguments that come from emotion, particularly those emotions like fear and anger. She then presents a really interesting case study. In 2001, the Holy Land Foundation was the largest Muslim charity in the United States, raising money and sending it to Palestine for widows, orphans, the homeless, and families of martyrs, as well as aiding deported Hamas activists in 1992. That was before Hamas was considered a terrorist organization. But after 9/11, the U.S. decided that HLF was itself a terrorist organization. They seized all of its assets and shut it down. In 2007, HLF and 5 of its members went on trial for 197 counts of supporting terrorism, money laundering, conspiracy, and tax fraud. And the jury in that case acquitted one of the members and was unable to decide about the others, which resulted in a mistrial. One juror reported that the whole case was based on assumptions that were based on suspicions. If they had been a Christian or Jewish group, I don't think prosecutors would have brought charges against them. The judge threw out their one acquittal, and all 5 of them were tried again the following year. This time, with a brand new jury, all 5 were convicted on all the counts that were brought against them. Bennett says that she observed these trials and noticed that in the first trial, a number of hardship releases were granted to lesser educated jurors who had fewer resources to sustain them over the projected length of the trial. This left a panel of more highly educated jurors available for jury selection. However, in the second trial, there were virtually no releases for hardship, despite several jurors pleased that jury service for the lengthy trial would force them into bankruptcy. This left the panel with a much higher number of less educated and anxiety-ridden jurors than were available for jury selection in the first trial. Additionally, the prosecution team, under significant pressure to succeed at the retrial, brought in a trial consultant and changed their jury selection strategy to target the better educated, more articulate, and arguably more intelligent jurors for release. So when I first read this, I thought, how on earth does she know all of this? And then I scrolled back up and read her bio and saw that she herself was a trial consultant who worked for a company that observed trials and advised clients on strategies related to things like jury selection, much like the unnamed consultant in her story, the one who taught the prosecutors how to kick smarter people off the jury so that they would be left with poor, scared, stupid racists so the Muslims could be convicted. Bennett goes on to helpfully describe for prosecutors how they might be able to tell who has a low IQ in their jury pool, like including questions about education on that initial questionnaire, and also including open-ended questions that require critical thinking. Also, check to see if the juror brought any reading material. Oh, and also, personal hygiene or lack thereof could be an indicator of low IQ or mental health. On a light note, mouth breathing is usually a dead giveaway for low IQ, absent physical illness. I found all this so completely bonkers that I looked for other articles Bennett had written, and I was not disappointed because she also offered this helpful advice for lawyers on how to work with millennial jurors, because you can't bump every 25-year-old off the jury, but you know you want to. To build rapport and credibility with millennials during a trial, you need to understand them. Their world has always included AIDS, a unified Germany, answering machines, and remote controls. Hope that helps. Just picturing the prosecutor really targeting those millennial jurors during opening statements. I still remember when my mom left me a message on my answering machine to tell me that my uncle has AIDS. The shock I felt is not dissimilar from the shock felt by Officer Truman when he found that bag of cocaine in the suspect's glove box. Anyway, while the small amount of research out there suggests that discriminating against educated or rational people is not a systemic problem, here's at least one example of a legal consultant who was actively encouraging her clients to do exactly that and claiming that it works. Having hit that pretty unsatisfying end, I finally decided to do one last desperate thing. I asked a lawyer for his own perspective. Ken White, aka Pope Hat, is not my lawyer, but I do value his commentary online, and he has helped me in the past. So I asked him if he thought that there was systemic anti-intellectual discrimination in jury selection, and or has he seen this used as a strategy? And his response was thus: yes, attorneys absolutely seek out to keep or reject critical thinkers, depending on the type of case. I don't think it's systemic in that the system doesn't enforce or demand it like racism. It's more strategic by lawyers, some more than others, relevant to some types of cases more than others. You'd want a scientist or critical thinker if you were the defense and wanted skepticism about claims, for instance. You wouldn't want them if you wanted emotion. There you have it. It's not just in our imagination. There needs to be a lot more research done to figure out exactly how widespread this is and if it's a problem that needs addressing, considering that it would mean prosecutors are exploiting juror ignorance in order to win criminal convictions, and at the same time, depriving critical thinkers of their right to serve on a jury. While reading up on all of this, I learned that the Founding Fathers intended jury duty to be an active role of thought and investigation, but over the years, the laws and the customs have been massaged to turn jurors into this passive blank slate who can't even have basic knowledge about a case before it begins, as opposed to the original intent, which was let's just bar the people who have direct familial or financial ties to the outcome. It's all given me a lot to think about, including, how am I going to handle my next jury questionnaire? Like, I'm never going to lie about my education, my values, or my understanding of concepts like jury nullification. But maybe there's an ethical way to ensure that a prosecutor can't unduly remove my right to serve on a jury. Like, maybe I could be less of a loudmouth know-it-all. I'm gonna add it to my New Year's resolutions. We'll see if it sticks. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.